Here we begin our sixth lecture for the course, History of the Ancient Near East. I'm your instructor, Justin Singleton. Having completed our single lecture on the Stone Age, as well as our lecture on the Sumerians, we move now to the very first empire, the Akkadians. And as such, we will look at this northern rise to power, the Semitic peoples, Sargon the Great, his successors, and then finally, the short-lived Ur-3 dynasty. As southern Mesopotamia continued through the third millennium, two major changes occurred. First, the climate changed. The post-glacial maximum sea level around 3000 BC placed the Persian Gulf about 200 kilometers into Mesopotamia, bringing the waters up to the city of Ur and, in fact, flooding the city and causing devastation. From about that point onward, the before-mentioned drying phase occurred, which forced the Persian Gulf, over the course of around 1,000 years, some 200 kilometers down, until it reached its present position around 2000 BC. Second, this caused changes in the way cities survived, as a changing landscape meant that city resources had shifted. In fact, cities in southern Mesopotamia from the early dynastic period until the Akkadian period lost around 14.5% of their population, many people preferring to leave the urban life in favor of village life, where life was, at least, more consistent. Northern Mesopotamia did not have the same troubles as the South. In the South, issues arose that caused the Southern culture to innovate ways to mitigate their problems, namely related to water. But as the Northern cultures had no need to organize, after all they lived upriver and could use the water however they wanted, the North found no need to urbanize. By the dawn of the early dynastic III period, when kingship arose in the South and long-distance trade was reestablished after centuries of isolation, the northern culture of Mesopotamia would adapt southern ways, including those technological and political novelties. Thus, from around 2600 BC, northern urban areas began to emerge, forming a political complexity that rivaled that of the South. While southern Mesopotamia was incurring more and more problems, including conflict likely caused by the changing environment, the cities of the north, although affected by the decline in southern culture, began to stabilize and experience their own urbanization process. Now, this was partly due to the rain-fed production of agricultural goods over the wide plains, as opposed to irrigation-fed crops that were constantly being affected by the drying environment, which gave the northern cities an aspect of economic control. Cities in northern Mesopotamia would create monumental palaces and their own temple complexes, creating their own political landscape. It should also be noted that the people of northern Mesopotamia were a different people group altogether. Now, this is not to say that the emerging Akkadian Empire was some sort of Semitic revolution, or even an invasion of Semitic peoples. In fact, the first Akkadian king of both the north and the south claimed kingship by appealing to the Sumerian people that Enlil, the patron god of the Sumerian city that he had just conquered, gave him the victory, of which the city priesthood agreed. Instead, this is to point out that the northern culture of Mesopotamia spoke a different language, a Semitic one, now known as Akkadian. Semites had already lived in the land for quite some time. In the southern cities, Semites had dwelt, mixed with Sumerians in marriage, and worked or fought alongside the people, without issue long before the Akkadian Empire was established. When the Akkadians eventually took rulership of the land, becoming the Akkadian Empire, the Semites retained a great respect for the Sumerians, their religion, and their language. although the administrative language became Akkadian. Local scribal traditions remained Sumerian, and Sumerian temples continued the worship of Sumerian gods. Although there was a cultural separation after some time, the Sumerian and Akkadian cultures became so intertwined that scholars now have difficulty separating the two. Even with this respect for Sumerian culture and tradition, the Semitic leadership did advance a Semitic culture, even replacing subordinate leadership with Semitic officials and establishing the king's daughter as the high priestess of a Sumerian god. Another key change includes the ownership of property. Whereas throughout the early dynastic period, the southern cities were overpowered by temple authority and eventually secular kings of prestige and influence, Akkadian social structures were still centered on kinship, much like the Sumerian culture before urbanization. Thus, changes were made. The military and administrative genius who made this all happen, Sargon, would eventually be titled Sargon the Great. Historical records suggest that the birth of Sargon was somewhat exceptional, paralleling the story of Moses, as he came from a poor family, was set adrift on the river, discovered by someone and raised in the court, and then rose to power. Other stories suggest that his mother was a high priestess, no doubt a claim to kingship. Later records describe Sargon's position as the cupbearer of the king of Kish, and how Sargon replaced this Sumerian king. Multiple other stories exist concerning Sargon's move to power, most establishing Sargon as legitimized by differing gods. But perhaps his throne name, Sharukin, which translates as the king is legitimate, suggests a more valid reason. He probably usurped the king of Kish before ultimately founding the city of Akkad. Being headquartered at Kish, a city both between the two rivers and between the north and south, Sargon was able to campaign against the north and the south militarily, conquering as he went. Royal inscriptions describe campaigns and both the capture and destruction of differing cities, beginning with conquering his economic foe, Lugalzagsi, who had previously conquered several cities, including Umma, Larsa, and Nippur. Sargon continued to fight, conquering the northern Semitic cities. His southern campaign specifically led to the colonization of the southern cities of Sumer. He may have campaigned into Lebanon, and even as far as into Anatolia. From conquered Sumer, where Sargon had placed Akkadian governors, he campaigned into Elam, sacking several cities, but leaving their kings as vassals in order to continue trade. For the first time ever, both the northern and southern cities were joined together under one head, thus establishing the First Empire. Sargon appears to have been the first king to have established a standing army, around 5,400 troops, and he nourished a bond with these soldiers by having a daily meal with them, and his humble beginnings may have established him as a man of the people. Sargon also stationed soldiers in some of the cities that he had conquered, ensuring the safety of the Akkadian governors that he had appointed. Interestingly, Sargon appears to have created a new theology of war, justifying his military campaigns as reflections of actions within the pantheon. Now, trade was important to Sargon, and by the end of his campaigns, he had created trade networks from the northern Levant and the Taurus Mountains of Anatolia to the Persian Gulf, and even the Indus Valley. He also introduced a uniform system of weights and measures. Unfortunately, this wide empire was difficult to maintain, and trade quickly broke down. After reigning the Akkadian Empire for 56 years, Sargon died of natural causes, leaving his empire to his son, Ramush, who continued the military campaigns of his father. Before too long, Ramush was obligated to quell several rebellions, including at Lagash, Umma, and Kazalu. Now, this was not necessarily new. Even Sargon had to deal with periodic revolts. But after Ramush had slaughtered thousands, including the entire population of certain cities, Ramush may have been assassinated by his own dignitaries. Manishtusu, the second son of Sargon, took the throne after his brother's death, and he successfully campaigned southward, gaining access to both silver and diorite, a stone used to make statues in Akkad. Some of these statues have even been recovered at Susa, Ashur, and Nineveh. Unfortunately, he continued an economic expansion of state resources by forcing private citizens to sell to the state their own personal lands, recording the transactions on an obelisk. Naram-Sin, the grandson of Sargon, would become the most important king of the Akkadian Empire, militarily campaigning in all four directions. After a series of rebellions, he retraced Sargon's campaigns, reconquering Akkadian lands. Both Sargon and his successors had altered warfare by replacing the traditionally few heavy armored units with very many lightly armored units, who were fast and mobile, and by introducing the use of archers on the battlefield. These tactics made it possible to expand and maintain the empire for as long as they did. Unfortunately, battlefield victories appear to have made an overly positive impression upon Naram-Sin, as he claimed himself as a living god. Now, this claim was not a replacement of the traditional deities, but rather he elevated himself above his humanly counterparts so that he became equal to the gods as a kind of protective deity. Ultimately, the theology of war that Sargon had established, that is, the believing that the actions of the king were reflected within the pantheon, came to a climax under Naram-Sin, as several stele equate his military accomplishments with the actions of the gods themselves. These aspects of the hero king caused both ideological and religious concerns for the Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia, particularly as the actions of the Akkadian kings were seen as impious and arrogant. In addition to military accomplishments, Naram-Sin also engaged in building projects such as the massive imperial palace at Tel Brak, which contained mud bricks stamped with the name of this king, and in ambassadorial achievements such as the diplomatic marriage of his daughter. Unfortunately, none of this would save the empire from destruction, as both rebellion and invasion brought the 150-year reign of the Akkadians to an end. Although Naram-Sin appears to have been the last true emperor of the Akkadian Empire, the empire did continue for a short time in a rather decreased size under Sharkali-Shari, son of Naram-Sin, who attempted war but ultimately failed. In reality, the Akkadian Empire ends with the invasion of the Gutians and the destruction of Akkad by Gutian hands. The Gutians, people believed to have originated from the Zagros region, attacked Mesopotamia and Elam, devastating the regions. It's likely that the Gutians took advantage of the Akkadian decline by raiding the area for resources. Unfortunately for the illiterate and nomadic Gutians, rulership in Mesopotamia was difficult, likely as they were not akin to agricultural lifestyle. Sumerian cities from Lagash to Uruk rebelled against the Gutian invaders, and ultimately Utu-Hagal of Uruk defeated them in combat, restoring Sumerian dominance, though with obvious Akkadian influence. After the defeat of the Gutians, Utu-Hagal of Uruk established a short-lived hegemonic power over the rest of the Mesopotamian cities. This was quickly replaced when Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, took power of the region, establishing the rather short-lived Ur-III Empire. Thus, the Akkadian and Earthry governments successfully united the southern Mesopotamia regions under one rule, but neither of them lasted very long. The Akkadians are a fascinating people, and we'll discuss them again later in this course. For now, our lecture ends. As always, feel free to reach out to me with any comments or questions.